The convoy of vehicles approaching Thornfield Hall resembled a funeral procession, solemn, purposeful, heavy with unspoken grief. In a way, Claire reflected, that's exactly what it was: the funeral of the Kerrigan family's carefully cultivated public image. Inspector Nolan led in his unmarked police car, followed by Margaret Kerrigan with her solicitor, Mr. Winters. Claire and Sean brought up the rear box, the morning sunlight doing little to dispel the shadow that seemed to hang over their journey back to the Kerrigan estate. "What do you think we'll find in James's secret compartment?" Sean asked, breaking the contemplative silence. Claire considered the question, her mind still processing the revelations from the safe deposit box. More specifics about the Kerrigan connection to Nazi-looted art, probably, but I'm more interested in what might be hidden in those tunnels beneath the house. "You think there could still be stolen artifacts down there? After all these years?" "It's possible," Claire replied. "Families like the Kerrigans often keep valuables for generations, especially items with complicated origins. Better to store them away than risk questions about provenance." As they turned through the imposing gates of Thornfield Hall, Claire noticed additional police vehicles already parked in the circular drive. The investigation into Ava's murder was clearly proceeding in parallel with their discoveries about the pendant. Catherine Kerrigan met them at the front door, her expression a careful mask of professional detachment despite what must be considerable personal turmoil. "Mother," she acknowledged with a nod. "Inspector, Dr. and Mrs. Murphy." Her gaze lingered briefly on Mr. Winters, a flicker of surprise crossing her features before she controlled it. "The police have been searching the grounds all morning. They're particularly interested in the old well house for some reason." "We need to access your father's study," Margaret replied without preamble. "Immediately." Catherine's composure slipped momentarily. "His study? But why?" "Because," Margaret interrupted, her voice steady despite the morning's revelations, "your father left information there that may be relevant to both the pendant and Ava's death." Without waiting for further response, Margaret led the way through the grand entrance hall and down the corridor to James's study. Inspector Nolan followed closely, with Mr. Winters, Claire, and Sean behind him. Catherine hesitated briefly before joining their procession, her legal training clearly battling with family loyalty. The study remained as they had left it the previous day, a time capsule of James Kerrigan's life, untouched since his death. Margaret crossed directly to the far wall, dominated by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. "According to James's letter," she explained, running her fingers along the shelving, "there's a hidden mechanism behind the third shelf, activated by the pendant setting." Inspector Nolan carefully removed the original pendant setting from its evidence bag, handling it with gloved hands. "Where exactly?" "Behind Dickens," Margaret replied, indicating a complete set of Charles Dickens novels bound in maroon leather. Apparently, James had a sense of irony, hidden secrets behind great expectations. With careful movements, Nolan removed several volumes, revealing the wooden back panel of the bookcase. At first glance, it appeared solid and unremarkable, but upon closer inspection, Claire noticed a small indentation that might accommodate the protrusion on the pendant setting. "There," she pointed, "that recess." Nolan nodded, positioning the pendant setting against the indentation. It fit perfectly, and with a slight turning motion, a distinct click sounded from within the wall. A section of the bookcase, approximately 2 feet square, swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a small compartment beyond. Inside sat a metal box, similar in appearance to the safe deposit box they'd opened earlier. Margaret reached for it with trembling hands, but then hesitated, turning to Inspector Nolan. "Perhaps you should," she said quietly, "in case there's evidence relevant to your investigation." Nolan nodded, carefully removing the box and placing it on James's desk. The room had grown crowded, with Catherine hovering near the doorway and Mr. Winters standing protectively close to Margaret. The box wasn't locked, opening easily to reveal several leather-bound journals, a collection of photographs, and a sealed envelope similar to the one James had left for Margaret in the safe deposit box. This one, however, bore no name, just the words, "In case of discovery," written in James's distinctive hand. "Mrs. Kerrigan," Nolan said formally, "while I understand this is deeply personal, I need to examine these materials as potential evidence. Margaret nodded her consent, though her gaze remained fixed on the envelope. As Nolan carefully examined the contents, his expression grew increasingly grave. The journals appeared to be James Kerrigan's detailed records of his father's wartime acquisitions, artworks, jewelry, rare books, and other valuables obtained from Jewish families across occupied Europe. Next to each entry was a notation indicating whether James had been able to trace descendants and make anonymous restitution. "This is extensive," Nolan commented, his professional tone not quite masking his shock at the scope of what he was seeing. "Mr. Kerrigan appears to have documented everything in remarkable detail." "James was methodical," Margaret replied, her voice hollow, "in business and apparently in atonement as well." Nolan turned his attention to the unmarked envelope, carefully opening it to reveal several pages of handwritten text. As he scanned the contents, his expression shifted from professional detachment to something closer to alarm. "Mrs. Kerrigan," he said carefully, "I believe you should read this." He handed her the letter with uncharacteristic gentleness. Margaret accepted it, her composure remarkably intact despite the continued revelations. As she read, however, her face paled visibly. "Mother?" Catherine stepped forward, concerned. "What is it?" Margaret didn't answer immediately, continuing to read until she reached the final page. When she looked up, her expression had transformed, grief and shock replaced by something harder, colder. "It seems," she said finally, her voice steady but distant, "that your father was not the only one aware of the Kerrigan family's Nazi connections." She turned to Catherine directly. "Your husband knew as well." Catherine's reaction was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath, color draining from her face. "That's impossible. David died 12 years ago." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "And according to James, David had been blackmailing him for years before that, threatening to expose the family's wartime activities unless James provided funds for his increasingly risky business ventures." Claire watched Catherine carefully, noting the shock in her expression appeared genuine. Whatever James had documented about his son-in-law's blackmail scheme seemed to be news to Catherine herself. "That can't be true," Catherine insisted, though her usual confidence was notably absent. "David would never." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Nolan interjected gently, indicating the journal open on the desk. "Mr. Kerrigan documented regular payments to your husband from 1998 until his death in 2011, explicitly describing them as silence money regarding the AC acquisitions, presumably referring to Archibald Kerrigan." Catherine sank into a nearby chair, her professional facade crumbling completely. "I knew nothing about this," she whispered. "Nothing." "There's more," Margaret continued, a strange calm settling over her as she referred back to James's letter. "According to this, David's death was not the accident we believed it to be." This revelation landed like a physical blow. Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" "James writes that David had become increasingly unstable, demanding larger sums and threatening not just to expose the family's secrets, but to implicate Catherine and Liam as well." Margaret's voice remained steady despite the devastating nature of what she was revealing. After a particularly volatile confrontation, David lost control and fell from the balcony of their Belfast apartment. "Fell?" Inspector Nolan repeated, his professional interest clearly piqued. "James suggests it wasn't entirely accidental," Margaret clarified, her gaze never leaving Catherine's stricken face, though whether David jumped or was helped remains deliberately ambiguous in his account. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Catherine's ragged breathing as she struggled to process these revelations about her late husband. "This is monstrous," she finally managed, anger beginning to replace shock. "Father kept these secrets for decades, let us believe lies about our own family history, about David's death, and now leaves this poisonous legacy behind." "There's a reason James documented everything so meticulously," Margaret replied, indicating the letter. "He believed we might all be in danger if the full extent of the Kerrigan wartime activities ever came to light, particularly if certain items were discovered." "Items?" Claire asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the study. Margaret looked up, seeming almost surprised to find Claire and Sean still present. "Yes, Apparently, not all the valuables Archibald acquired have been accounted for. James writes of significant artifacts still hidden somewhere on the estate, items too distinctive to sell or display, but too valuable to destroy. The tunnels, Sean said, connecting back to what they'd learned at the bank. The ones accessed by the antique key from the safe deposit box. Precisely, Margaret confirmed. James kept the key separate from these documents deliberately, ensuring that even if someone discovered his records, they couldn't easily access what remains hidden beneath Thornfield. Inspector Nolan, who had been examining the journals while they spoke, looked up with renewed purpose. Mrs. Kerrigan, given what we've discovered, I need to expand our search of the property immediately. These tunnels could contain evidence relevant not just to historical crimes, but potentially to your granddaughter's murder as well. Of course, Margaret agreed, rising from her chair with remarkable composure given the circumstances. The key is in your evidence bag from the bank. I believe the entrance to the tunnels is in the old wine cellar, according to James's letter. Mother, Catherine interjected, her legal instincts apparently reasserting themselves despite her personal distress. Are you certain this is wise? Without legal counsel reviewing these documents first. My granddaughter is dead, Margaret cut her off, her voice suddenly sharp. Murdered, and it seems increasingly likely that her death is connected to these family secrets. I will not obstruct justice for the sake of the Kerrigan reputation, Catherine. That era ends today. Before Catherine could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Robert Kerrigan appeared in the doorway, his face flushed and his breathing labored, as though he'd been running. What's happening? He demanded, taking in the unusual gathering in his father's study. The police are swarming the grounds, asking about old tunnels, and Liam says they've been questioning him about Ava's movements the night she died. His gaze fell on the open compartment in the bookcase, then to the documents spread across James's desk. What is all this? He asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. The truth, Margaret replied simply, about your father, your grandfather, and the real source of the Kerrigan fortune. Mother, please, Catherine interjected, standing to face her brother. Robert, there have been some discoveries about father's activities after the war, about the pendant's origins. Nazi-looted art, Margaret stated bluntly, apparently done with euphemisms and gentle phrasing. Your grandfather was trafficking in valuables stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust. Your father discovered this after Archibald died and spent decades trying to make anonymous restitution while protecting the family from scandal. Robert stared at his mother in stunned disbelief, then at the documents on the desk, then back to Margaret. That's impossible, he stammered. Grandfather was a respected businessman, a philanthropist. A facade, Margaret replied coldly, built on the suffering of others. James documented everything, Robert. There can be no more denial. Robert's face had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. He reached for the doorframe to steady himself, looking suddenly older and more vulnerable than Claire had seen him previously. And Ava? He asked quietly. What does this have to do with my daughter's death? It was Inspector Nolan who answered, his tone gentle but firm. We believe Miss Kerrigan may have discovered some of this information through her own research. If she confronted someone with what she knew. The implication hung heavily in the air. Robert's expression crumpled, grief overtaking shock. Who? He asked, his voice breaking. Who would kill her over old family secrets? That's what we're trying to determine, Nolan replied, which is why we need to search the tunnels beneath the house. If Miss Kerrigan discovered their existence and what they contain, then she might have been killed to prevent her from revealing it. Claire finished quietly. Robert seemed to notice her and Sean for the first time. Why are you even here? He demanded, anger briefly displacing grief. This is a family matter. Dr. and Mrs. Murphy are here at my request, Margaret said firmly, as witnesses to what we've discovered, independent observers without family bias. Bias? Robert repeated incredulously. Of course we're biased. This is our family, our history being torn apart. And my granddaughter, your daughter, is dead, Margaret reminded him, her voice cold. Murdered, Robert, strangled, and then posed to look like a suicide. Does your concern for family reputation outweigh justice for Ava? The question struck Robert like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, genuine anguish contorting his features. "Of course not," he whispered. "I want whoever killed her to pay. I can't believe anyone in our family would." "Unfortunately, the evidence suggests otherwise," Inspector Nolan interjected, gathering the journals and photographs from James's desk. "Mrs. Kerrigan, I need to secure these documents and begin searching the tunnels immediately. Would you and Mr. Winters accompany me to identify the entrance?" Margaret nodded, her composure once again impeccable despite the morning's devastating revelations. As she moved to follow Nolan, she paused beside Catherine's chair. "I understand this is difficult," she said, her tone softening slightly. "Learning about David's true nature, about your father's deceptions. But remember, Ava deserves justice, whatever that costs us." Catherine looked up at her mother, conflict evident in her expression. "And if the truth destroys everything, the foundation, the charitable trusts, our entire legacy, then we will rebuild," Margaret replied simply. "On honesty this time, not deception." As Margaret departed with Nolan and Mr. Winters, Catherine and Robert remained in the study, both seemingly stunned by the morning's revelations. Claire hesitated, unsure whether to follow Margaret or remain with the siblings. "I think we should go with them," Sean said quietly, "to see what's in those tunnels." Claire nodded agreement, but before they could leave, Catherine looked up, her expression sharpened by sudden realization. "Wait," she said. "Where's Fiona? Has anyone seen her this morning?" Robert frowned, momentarily distracted from his grief. "Not since breakfast. She said she was going for a walk in the gardens to clear her head." A look passed between the siblings, something like shared suspicion or concern. "What is it?" Claire asked, sensing the shift in their demeanor. Catherine hesitated, then appeared to make a decision. Fiona was always closest to father, the only one he confided in regularly about family business, even after she moved to Paris. If anyone besides James knew about these tunnels, about what they contain, it would be Fiona, Robert finished. The implication hung in the air, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Of all the Kerrigans, the absent daughter who had returned only after Ava's death was perhaps the most mysterious and potentially the most knowledgeable about the family's buried secrets. "We should find her," Claire suggested, "before the police begin searching the tunnels." Catherine nodded, rising from her chair with renewed purpose. "Robert, check the gardens and greenhouse. I'll look in her room and the places she used to go when we were children." As the siblings departed on their search, Claire turned to Sean. "We should follow Margaret and Nolan to the cellars. Whatever is in those tunnels could be the key to understanding why Ava was killed." Sean nodded agreement, but his expression remained troubled. "This is becoming more complicated by the minute. Nazi-looted art, hidden tunnels, family blackmail, and now Fiona's suspicious absence." "The Kerrigans have maintained their secrets for generations," Claire replied, as they made their way toward the servants' staircase that would lead to the cellars. "But secrets this dark have a way of demanding to be revealed eventually." What neither of them voiced aloud was the growing certainty that the final revelations would be the most devastating of all, and that Ava Kerrigan had died for knowing too much about her family's buried past. The cellars beneath Thornfield Hall were exactly as Claire had imagined they would be. Cavernous stone chambers with vaulted ceilings, musty air heavy with the smell of earth and aged wood, and row upon row of wine racks containing bottles whose labels had faded with time. Their footsteps echoed as they descended the narrow stone staircase, following the sounds of voices that indicated Margaret and Inspector Nolan had already arrived. They found them in the furthest chamber, where the elegant organization of the wine cellar gave way to rougher stonework and bare walls. Margaret stood beside a massive oak wine rack that appeared to be built into the wall itself, while Inspector Nolan examined the ancient key from the safe deposit box. "Ah, Dr. and Mrs. Murphy," Margaret acknowledged their arrival. "I was just explaining to Inspector Nolan that according to James's letter, this wine rack conceals the entrance to the tunnels." "It's an ingenious design," Claire observed, noting how the rack appeared to be a permanent, immovable fixture, unless one knew otherwise, hidden in plain sight. Nolan was studying the key thoughtfully. "The question is where exactly it fits. I don't see an obvious keyhole. Margaret gestured toward the stone wall beside the rack. James writes that there's a loose stone with a mechanism behind it. Claire approached the wall, her conservator's training giving her an eye for subtle inconsistencies in surface and texture. After a moment's examination, she indicated a stone at approximately waist height that appeared slightly different from its neighbors, perhaps a shade lighter, its edges more precisely cut. This one, she suggested. It doesn't match the surrounding masonry exactly. Nolan pressed the stone gently, and to everyone's surprise, it moved inward with minimal resistance, revealing a small cavity behind it containing what appeared to be a brass lock mechanism. Remarkable, Margaret murmured. All these years, living above these tunnels, and I never knew they existed. Nolan carefully inserted the antique key into the lock, turning it with a deliberate motion. A deep, resonant click sounded from within the wall, followed by the grinding of metal against stone as hidden gears engaged. Slowly, the entire wine rack began to pivot outward from the wall, revealing a dark passageway beyond. I've called for additional officers and evidence technicians, Nolan explained, retrieving a powerful flashlight from his coat pocket. But given what we've already discovered, I think we should conduct an initial assessment immediately. Agreed, Margaret said firmly. I want to know what James was protecting or concealing all these years. Nolan switched on his flashlight, illuminating a narrow stone tunnel that extended beyond the beam's reach. The air that wafted from the opening was noticeably cooler and carried a distinctive musty scent, the smell of a space long sealed and undisturbed. Mrs. Kerrigan, Nolan said carefully, perhaps you should wait here while I conduct an initial sweep. We don't know what condition these tunnels are in or what we might find. Margaret's expression hardened with determination. Inspector, I am 84 years old and have just discovered that my entire life has been built on deception. I will not be sheltered from further truths, however unpleasant. Recognizing the futility of arguing, Nolan nodded and handed her a second flashlight from his pocket. Stay close, please, and be mindful of loose stonework or uneven flooring. Claire and Sean exchanged glances, silently agreeing to follow. The four of them entered the tunnel in single file, with Nolan leading the way, followed by Margaret, then Claire, and Sean bringing up the rear. The passage was narrower than Claire had expected, forcing them to proceed in single file. The stonework was expertly crafted, but clearly ancient, part of the original construction of Thornfield Hall in the mid-19th century, she guessed. More surprising was the presence of electric lighting. Simple bulbs in metal cages mounted at intervals along the wall, though long disconnected from any power source. James must have had these installed, Margaret observed, noting Claire's interest in the fixtures. Perhaps when he discovered what his father had hidden down here. After approximately 30 meters, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber with a vaulted ceiling similar to the wine cellar. Unlike the rough utility of the tunnel, however, this space had been fitted out with wooden shelving, metal cabinets, and what appeared to be a small workspace with a desk and chair. All were covered in a thick layer of dust, suggesting no one had disturbed this room in many years. Nolan swept his flashlight methodically across the space, illuminating what lay on the shelves and within the glass-fronted cabinets. What they revealed made Claire's breath catch in her throat. Art. Dozens of paintings, carefully stored in protective wrappings but clearly valuable works. Sculptures wrapped in aged linen. Display cases containing jewelry, silver objects, rare books. Each item tagged with a small paper label in faded ink. My God, Margaret whispered, her composure finally cracking as she took in the extent of what they'd discovered. This is all stolen, isn't it? Taken from Jewish families during the Holocaust. It appears so, Nolan confirmed grimly, examining one of the labels. This notation seems to indicate the original owner, Bernstein Collection, Vienna, 1938, and the date of acquisition by Archibald Kerrigan. Claire approached one of the paintings, carefully lifting the protective covering to reveal a small but exquisite landscape she immediately recognized as the work of Gustav Klimt. This alone would be worth millions, she said quietly. And there are dozens more paintings here, many by significant artists of the early 20th century. James's letter mentioned that some items were too distinctive to sell or display, Margaret recalled, her voice distant as she struggled to process what she was seeing, too directly connected to known collections that had been documented as looted during the war. So Archibald hid them here, Sean concluded, and later, when James discovered them, he couldn't bring himself to destroy them, but also couldn't risk them being found. A terrible compromise, Margaret said softly, preserving beautiful things born of terrible crimes. Nolan had moved to the desk, where he carefully opened a leather-bound ledger book. This appears to be a complete inventory, he said, scanning the pages. Each item cataloged with its origin, the circumstances of acquisition, and notes about the original owners. James's work, most likely, Margaret suggested, trying to document everything so that someday, perhaps, restitution could be made. As they continued examining the chamber, Claire noticed a smaller tunnel leading off from the main room. "There's more," she said, directing her flashlight toward the opening. Nolan nodded. "Let's continue our exploration. Stay together, please." The secondary tunnel was shorter, leading to a smaller chamber that appeared to serve a different purpose entirely. Instead of art storage, this room contained filing cabinets, a small safe, and walls lined with documents in protective sleeves. "Business records," Nolan observed, examining one of the framed documents. "Shipping manifests, customs declarations, correspondence. The paper trail of my father-in-law's crimes," Margaret said bitterly, "preserved by James as evidence of the family's complicity." Claire approached the safe, noting that unlike the dust-covered cabinets, it showed signs of more recent access. The dial was cleaner, the metal less tarnished. "Inspector," she called, "this safe appears to have been used more recently than the rest of the room." Nolan joined her, examining the safe with professional interest. "You're right. The question is whether James was the last person to access it or someone else." "The combination might be in his journals," Margaret suggested. James was methodical about recording such details. Before Nolan could respond, the sound of footsteps in the main tunnel caught their attention. They turned to see two police officers appear at the chamber entrance, accompanied by Robert and Catherine Kerrigan. "Inspector," one of the officers called, "we've found something you should see." "What is it?" Nolan asked, moving toward them. "Signs of recent activity in another section of the tunnels," the officer replied. "And we've located Miss Fiona Kerrigan. She's in what appears to be a photography darkroom off the main passage." "A darkroom?" Margaret repeated, surprised. "I knew nothing about that. According to Miss Kerrigan, it was set up by her father decades ago," the officer explained. "She claims she's been documenting items from the collection for some kind of restitution project." The explanation sounded plausible, particularly given what they now knew about James's efforts to track down the original owners of the looted items. But the timing, Fiona working in a hidden darkroom just as the police were searching the estate, struck Claire as suspiciously convenient. "Take us to her," Nolan instructed. "Mrs. Kerrigan, Dr. and Mrs. Murphy, please stay with Officer Jenkins." He indicated the second policeman. "We'll need to process these rooms carefully as potential crime scenes." As Nolan departed with the first officer, an uncomfortable silence fell over the remaining group. Catherine stared at the collection of looted art with undisguised horror, while Robert seemed unable to process what he was seeing, his gaze unfocused and his breathing shallow. "Did either of you know about any of this?" Claire asked them gently. "About what was hidden down here?" Catherine shook her head firmly. "No, Father never spoke of tunnels or hidden collections. The wine cellar itself was off limits to us as children. We assumed because of the valuable vintages stored there." "But Fiona knew," Robert said bitterly. "Of course she did. Father always told her everything." "Not everything," Margaret corrected. According to his letter, James kept many secrets even from Fiona, but he did entrust her with documenting the collection several years before his death. Apparently, he was planning a way to anonymously return items to their rightful owners or their descendants. "And what were we supposed to do when the Kerrigan fortune suddenly diminished by millions?" Catherine asked, a hint of her legal pragmatism reasserting itself. "When questions were asked about where these valuable items had gone." "James had a plan for that too," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the ledger Nolan had been examining. "A a systematic, gradual dispersal over many years, small donations to museums attributed to anonymous collectors, private sales to fund trusts for Holocaust education and remembrance. He was trying to make amends without destroying the family in the process. Noble intentions, Robert said sarcastically, while continuing to benefit from stolen property for decades. Margaret fixed her son with a cold stare. Your father was a deeply flawed man who discovered a terrible truth and tried to address it imperfectly. Before you judge him too harshly, Robert, consider how you might have handled such a discovery. Before Robert could respond, Officer Jenkins's radio crackled with Nolan's voice requesting assistance in the darkroom. The officer hesitated, clearly torn between following orders to remain with them and responding to his superior's call. Go, Margaret instructed him. We'll wait here. After another moment's hesitation, Jenkins nodded and hurried in the direction Nolan had taken, leaving the Kerrigans alone with Claire and Sean. What do you think they found? Catherine asked, her professional composure slipping to reveal genuine anxiety. Whatever it is, Sean replied carefully, it seems to involve your sister and her activities down here. Fiona wouldn't harm Ava, Robert said, though his tone lacked conviction. They were close, despite the age difference. Ava admired her independence, her artistic lifestyle. But if Ava discovered what Fiona was doing, Catherine countered, if she threatened to expose it before Fiona's work was complete, the implication hung heavily in the air. Claire thought back to her brief interactions with Fiona Kerrigan, the calm, composed woman who had seemed strangely detached from the family drama unfolding around her. There had been something calculating in her demeanor, Claire realized now, something watchful. That cryptic warning she gave us, Claire said to Sean. Not all players in this drama are in that room. She wasn't just referring to herself. Sean nodded, understanding her train of thought. She might have been suggesting someone outside the immediate family is involved. Someone connected to the collection, perhaps. Like Margaret Byrne, Catherine suggested suddenly. If she was blackmailing father about the pendant for years, who's to say she didn't know about all of this as well? Or David, Robert added, glancing at his sister apologetically. If he was blackmailing father too, maybe he passed that information to someone else before his death. Margaret had been silent during this exchange, her gaze fixed on the collection of stolen art surrounding them. Now she turned back to the group, her expression resolute. Speculation without evidence is pointless, she said firmly. When Inspector Nolan returns, we will cooperate fully with whatever he requires. In the meantime, she gestured toward the ledger on the desk. Perhaps we should educate ourselves about exactly what Archibald acquired and from whom. The truth, however painful, is preferable to continued ignorance. As they gathered around the desk to examine the ledger, Claire couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The hidden chambers beneath Thornfield Hall had revealed one set of family secrets, but she suspected others remained concealed, secrets potentially worth killing to protect. And somewhere in the labyrinth of tunnels, Fiona Kerrigan was explaining her presence in a darkroom that no one else in the family had known existed. Whatever story she told Inspector Nolan might determine not just her own fate, but the future of the entire Kerrigan dynasty. Meanwhile, the question of who had killed Ava Kerrigan and why remained unanswered, though Claire suspected they were closer to the truth than ever before.